Most of you perhaps will remember that the ending of the Cold War in the 1980s prompted really a great flurry of democracy promotion. And so it seemed that once the two superpowers didn't have to pour all their energies into battling each other in various forums, including the United Nations, the stage was then set for many more cooperative ventures. The end of the Cold War also appeared to have marked liberal democracy as the best possible form of government. So this allowed observers such as Francis Fukuyama famously to claim that we had in fact reached the end of history. And to quote him directly, we'd got to the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalisation of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So it was possible to make these very triumphalist claims at this time. So those were two features that led into the democracy building, but the further for democracy building was given even more oxygen by the attacks of the 11th September 2001. So this commitment to democracy building as a bastion against terrorism was enthusiastically endorsed by our own Prime Minister, John Howard, and Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. So we can think very readily of some examples where Australia was involved and where we weren't involved, but we can think of the UN intervention in East Timor in 1999, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the invasion of Iraq and the intervention in the Solomon Islands in 2003, all as very different types of international democracy building. And last year's Arab Spring we could think of in the same light. Of course, it wasn't brought about directly by outside intervention, but we now see it very regularly analysed in the Western press, in the Western literature, as part of what's called the inevitable democracy tsunami that is sweeping the Middle East. However, as our newspapers remind us daily, almost all the countries caught up in this new wave of democracies have had really serious problems. They've been accompanied by an increase in insecurity, in unemployment, in crime, in corruption, and in lawlessness. And we can see around us political leaders are looking for dignified ways to escape some of these terrible morasses, leading to tactics that had long been rejected. For example, the move by the United States in the case of Afghanistan to negotiate with the Taliban, something considered absolutely out of the question, but now it's seen as one possible exit route. But those are all background. The problem that I really want to look at today is the one that I think that's been most overlooked in analyses of the pitfalls of democracy promotion over the last 20 years, and this is the situation of women. Now, although women have been in all these cases critical in agitating for political change, once the change arrives, it seems they very quickly become the losers in the new political dispensation. And one observer has nicely summarised this by saying, overthrowing dictators is much easier than overturning the pervasive supremacy of men. Now, just to take one example, we can see this very clearly in the case of Iraq. Women's rights were actually deployed as one rationale for the invasion in 2003. The idea was that if you get rid of a dictator, you build democracy, this would lead to much greater respect for women's rights. But despite this rhetoric, little attention was in fact given to women's representation in the new Iraq. And right from the beginning, it was striking that the Iraq government in exile, which was created by the United States before the invasion, I was very struck by the fact that there were 3 women out of 65 members. And when the Coalition Provisional Authority, that was the vehicle that the United States used initially to govern Iran, there were finally 3 women out of 25 on the Iraqi Governing Council. And it was very striking that the United States, which of course initially led much of the democracy building in Iraq, was deeply ambivalent about the role of women, even though it had used the language of women's rights as one of the reasons to go in. It then was very reluctant to follow that through. And interestingly, in 2004, a group of Iraqi women's non-government organisations called for a 50% quota for women in the body that was going to draft the new constitution. And the main American players in Iraq said we cannot have quotas because this is inconsistent with United States anti-affirmative action policies. A very strange move to use US constitutional law in this context. Now, finally, when the Iraqi constitution was drafted in 2005, there are a number of relatively progressive provisions referring to women's right to vote and women's right to stand for election and so on. And it contains an aspiration, rather than a requirement, that 25% of the Council of Representatives, the Parliament, should be women. But it's very striking that despite these statements, the Constitution also has a declaration, a formal declaration very early in the Constitution, that Islam is the fundamental source of legislation. And this is quoting the Constitution, no law that contradicts the established provisions of Islam may be established. Now, of course, the implications for women depend very, very much on the interpretation of Sharia law that's adopted. But the appointment of judges to the critical court has so far been very, very conservative. Very fundamentalist religious leaders have been appointed to the court. And there's grave fears that the Constitution, seemingly progressive, could actually be used to invalidate laws in Iraq that were adopted actually very early in 1959, which accord women equal rights in relation to marriage, divorce, and inheritance. But much, much more significantly for women, I think the invasion of Iraq, we can see, and this was very clear from early on, has really replaced a secular regime with a government of strong religious affiliation. Rebel groups, too, are also characterised by a commitment to fundamentalist religion. And so it seems that the major protagonists in the very chaotic process of democracy building in Iraq are at best ambivalent and at worst openly hostile to the involvement of women. And of course, meanwhile, the terrible continuing violence in Iraq that's been unleashed has destroyed daily domestic security, leaving little space for women's lives. Iraqi women face huge systematic violence and discrimination, both outside the home, but particularly within the home as well. That's just one example. We can see a very, very similar picture in the context of Afghanistan. And I think now it's possible to say, over 10 years after the invasion, that it's done almost nothing for women's lives, leaving them in a very insecure and dangerous environment. Now, of course, there is a real irony here, because both the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, as I've said, were justified to some extent on the basis of promoting women's rights. And I still recall very, very clearly an extraordinary intervention that Laura Bush made in this debate in 2001, when she was actually allowed to take over her husband's weekly radio program. And she gave a talk before the invasion about whether the invasion of Iraq was a good idea or not. And one of the things she emphasised in that speech was that it was very important, she said, to promote the right of Afghan women to wear nail polish. It seemed an extraordinary and very slight type of right to invoke in this respect. But this failure of democracy promotion goes much, much broader than the Middle East. And we can take very close to home Timor-Leste, a country in which Australia and Australians have played quite a significant role. Now, as you're probably all aware, Timorese women were deeply involved in the 25-year independence struggle against Indonesia and had suffered many types of violence, such as rape and sexual slavery. But they've ended up effectively marginalised in designing the new Timor-Leste that became independent 10 years ago. So today in Timor-Leste, it's true that women make up 1/3 of the members of parliament, but otherwise women are very poorly represented in public life and in governmental positions. Domestic violence remains at extremely high levels, and women have almost no hope of economic freedom. The most recent report from the UN Development Programme reports that women receive less food than men in Timor-Leste, and that 1/3 of women between the ages of 14 and 49 officially meet the malnourishment indicators. Women's rates of fertility in Timor-Leste are the highest in the world, as are the rates of maternal death in childbirth. To go to another part of the world then, more recently in the context of a so-called Arab Spring, We can see too in that context that Egyptian women were really critical in the pro-democracy movement, not just last year but over the last decade in labour movements and so on before that. But they've been very quickly pushed back into the private realm of home, hearth and family. And it's striking that in the most recent elections, less than 2% of the seats in the new parliament will be held by women. So it seems that even though while the status of women is often deployed as a trigger for intervention and a rationale for democracy building, it seems to very quickly evaporate as a serious political issue. Well, why do women fare so badly in democracy building projects? I want to propose 3 reasons. The first one is that women are simply not involved in democracy design. Think of all the negotiations in relation to Afghanistan or the Arab Spring, and we only ever see men involved in that. It's very striking, for example, that in Libya's National Transitional Council, the so-called the liberators there, the 2 women among 61 men involved in the negotiations. Now, this is often explained as due to the need to get combatants at the table. So you have to get the combatants at the table, and of course these are largely men. But this seems a very, very narrow way of understanding the roles of women. Now, the United Nations over 10 years ago adopted a very significant resolution, the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which committed all countries to ensuring that women participated in peace building. But when we look at the way that resolution has been sidelined, it seems an example of what's been described as the United Nations AAA syndrome with respect to women and peace: apathy, ad hoc practices and amnesia. We can see, just for example, if we're just looking at the number of people appointed by Secretaries General to the point of mediators in conflict, that when Kofi Annan left office barely 5 years ago as Secretary General, he had 18 special representatives in conflict areas, none of whom were women. And Ban Ki-moon, the current Secretary General of the United Nations, who's appointed many, many more such mediators, he has 41 of them. Of those 41, 4 are women. So that's the first issue. Women are simply not involved in democracy design. A second issue, I think, for women is that women's interests are typically bargained away for political support, and claims of culture are used as trumps against women's rights. So we can see this, for example, in East Timor, where the idea of women's traditional roles in the home, which pervade East Timorese society and which have been supported by the deeply religious East Timorese society, have allowed leaders, particularly Janana Guzmão, to resist greater engagement with the lives of women. We can see this also in the context of Iraq. And as I've said, there's some irony because actually under Saddam Hussein's authoritarian and dictatorial rule, women actually had many more rights in Iraq than in most other parts of the Middle East. But the 2003 invasion of Iraq has allowed, among other things, really an assertive masculine traditionalism to reclaim authenticity and authority. And I think for Iraqi women, they seem to have lost all their gains. Now, we also see that in this context, control over women's bodies is often a feature of masculine cultures manifested in new democracies. So in order to assert their independence, we see women's bodies often becoming the battleground. And a nice example of this is the law adopted by Afghanistan in 2009. It's a law on personal status, which requires Shiite women to obtain a male's relative's permission to leave their house, to seek employment or education, and requires them to accede to their husband's sexual demands. This law was adopted by Hamid Karzai's government to gain the support of the Shia community, even though it clearly violates Afghanistan's international human rights commitments. But at the same time, we must be aware that the language of women's rights can sometimes be appropriated by authoritarian governments. So, for example, in Egypt, Suzanne Mubarak, the wife of the deposed dictator, used the discourse of women's rights to enhance her international status. The third reason, I think, for this, the problem, is that a very crude model of democracy is used, which associates democracy with Western-style institutions. So most models of democracy that are used in the West and by international institutions really focus on elections as the ultimate democratic goal. And stability is given much greater priority than social justice. So in the last 2 minutes, I then want to address, well, if these are some of the problems what can we do about it? So my 3 prescriptions for what we can do about it echo the problems that I've just identified. First of all, obviously we have to insist that women are at the table when democracies are being designed. It shouldn't be acceptable to negotiate the terms of democracies without women being involved in equal numbers to men. I think we should insist that our own governments support peace processes abroad only when women's voices are heard equally with men's, and that international organisations, of which we're a part, take their commitments to women's equality seriously. I think this may require quotas, a very, in some ways, flawed and problematic strategy, but it seems to me it's critical in the short term in this area. Secondly, I think we have to be very sceptical about claims of culture in the context of women's rights. I think we really have to, every time a claim of culture is raised to, as it were, defeat a claim of women's rights, we have to start asking questions such as, well, whose culture is being invoked? In whose name is the argument advanced? Who's going to win and who's going to lose by that claim of culture? And finally, I think we've got to change the way that we understand the idea of democracy. We have to understand it as much less about institutions, particularly Western-style institutions, and much, much more about relationships and justice. So the Western tendency really, and this happened very much in Timor-Leste, is to turn up with a list of institutions that every democracy should have and start building the buildings for those institutions. A huge focus on elections in that context. It seems to me a much richer understanding of democracy, which was formulated by the political scientist David Beetham, says, no, we should think about democracy in a different way. It's actually based on 2 principles. First of all, popular control over collective decision-making, and secondly, equality between citizens in exercising that control. So popular control over collective decision-making and equality between citizens in exercising that control. Now, of course, they're very general principles. They'll translate in different societies in many different ways. And it seems to me they'll be most powerful when linked with local forms of democracy rather than imported models. So I hope that these 3 proposals that I've very briefly sketched will go some way to enable women to ride the new waves of democracy and to be empowered by them, instead of being drowned by them as the waves crash.
Yeah, I was just, when you talk about invoking culture, I assume you also mean invoking religion and in particular Muslim religious practices. How reconcilable is democracy as we understand it, I suppose, with, for example, Sharia law in the long run, and what does that mean for women in these countries?
I should just start off by saying that I think that it's not just Sharia law in the context of Islamic countries. I would say that the Catholic Church in East Timor has also, there are some it's played a positive role in some ways in supporting the liberation movement, and it's played, I think, a very problematic role as well. So I certainly just don't want to focus on Islam. I mean, I would say, and I'm no Islamic scholar, that of course what's critical is the interpretation given to Sharia. So it's not that Sharia law is inevitably at odds with women's rights or a full democracy, by no means. And of course there have been a number of really very major Islamic commentators have made that point, that Islam is perfectly consistent with democracy. It depends, as it does with many religions, precisely on the type of interpretation that you want to give to it. And I think that there are, examples where you can see, quite open-minded governments who are in Islamic countries operating. So I don't think there's an automatic contradiction there at all. But it's very, very easy. I guess my criticism was mainly based really at Western countries involved in democracy building, who, as quickly as the religion or the culture card is raised, tend to back off and say, oh, terribly sorry. It's really used as a trump card to prevent any changes to the status quo. That was what I was attacking, really.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Dakani, and I was actually born in Afghanistan, but I've lived here a long time. Just on the subject of Sharia, I think one of our most flawed assumptions is that Sharia is actually being imposed correctly in countries like Afghanistan. Actually, what's being done is that Islamic law has been bastardized to suit the patriarchy in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq and Iran. The other thing I just wanted to mention was that I'm really glad you touched on or focused on our tendency to kind of import Western ideals into these countries that already have so many problems, and women are struggling for fundamental rights such as, avoiding domestic violence or food for their children or an education. And we go in and we expect that, we're going to see women as politicians when in fact that would be the most dangerous thing for them. And I think maybe one of the biggest failings for democracy as for us in a Western country is the lack of accountability that we can hold our leaders to when they do use the "we're going into this country to liberate women" and then forget about them altogether and just make the situation worse for them in the long run.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I completely agree with you, and I think that we can now see, if you go back, it's very sobering if you go back and look at the rhetoric of a decade ago or less than a decade ago in the context of the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, what was sort of said there. And it's sometimes, just as a normal citizen, it's sometimes quite shocking to think that devastating political actions such as invading a country can take place on things so manifestly incorrect. And we know now about all the problematic intelligence that was relied on. But what isn't often acknowledged by our political leaders is the havoc that has been caused. Not to say was good. I mean, nobody, I think, would want to defend Saddam Hussein or so on. But we haven't yet acknowledged, we focused on that as the single victory and not acknowledged the shocking position that we've put all Iraqis or Afghans in, but particularly women.
Thank you very much, Hilary. I'm interested in the idea that patriarchy in states that haven't had the history of development of democratic or community-based politics can be changed because of the will of the West. I've been watching some of the television programs on the history, say, of the British Isles, and you get to see there how long it took to work through the ruling classes and the people who fought wars, etc. Just history upon history upon history, hundreds of years to effect change that ended up somewhere like an imperfect democracy that we have today. And here we seem to be trying to impose a Western-style democracy on countries that have huge issues to do with tribalism and patriarchy themselves. The cynicism of the West is amazing.
Yeah, I think that what's extraordinary is the way that I think this is now, and this is my real fear, a lot of these very glib practices and the idea that you just have, it's almost mix it and stir sort of idea of democracy is really taking hold at the institutional level in places like the European Union, the United Nations and so on, this sense that you could really just pick up, go in, it'll probably be 3 or 4 years and then you'll be able to get out. It's very interesting. I mean, these are so varied, but I've been struck by the fact that, for example, a case in which Australia is very closely involved, Ramsey, the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, something that we led in 2003. Speaking to people involved in that, you now get quite a bit more thoughtful respect and people saying to think about going in and bringing democracy in 3 years or 4 is just absolutely crazy. This has to be a whole generational commitment. And also that you, the idea of empowering local people, not just bringing in your ideas and then flying off to your next destination. So I think in some institutions we're beginning to see some realisation of this. It's striking. Some of the most interesting, I think, developments in democracy, perhaps in this, well, in the last century, in this century, John Keane in his fantastic History of Democracy, I don't know how many of you have read that, the huge book. He's a professor of history at Sydney University, but he makes the point in that some of the most interesting experiments in democracy have actually occurred at the local village level in India, And he has a whole lot sort of devoted to these really interesting indigenous forms of democracy that would not be recognised by the US State Department as clearly. But he makes a very cogent case there that these are the type of things that we should be fostering. Local experiments that sometimes they stumble, sometimes they fail, but often they throw up fascinating forms of popular control over collective decision-making, that one critical feature of democracy. Well, increasingly well. And in fact, the current president of India, in a sense, made her political career on the back of starting out in the grassroots politics, and now she's, currently the President of India, a very, very powerful woman. So it's mixed, to be honest, but you do see some of these extraordinary cases of women's progress.
For one last question, I'm sorry, or maybe two. We can squeeze in two more.
Oh, mine's along much the same lines. Just to follow on from an earlier question where the woman was talking about the popular control and what it led to with Obama's health reforms for women, that popular control can in fact undermine rights of people, as we've seen, or even respect or equality of people. And I'm just wondering how you'd even just go about balancing that sort of, aim with the rights aim.
Thanks for that question. Just very quickly, I would say that the reason why I'm quite attracted to David Beetham's summary, it's a very general one, popular control over collective decision-making is one. But on the other hand, he said, and equality between citizens in exercising that control. It's a very important counterbalancing principle. And I would say, I think you might have been referring to Barbara Wertheim's point there, that I would say that we know in the American political system, I'm no expert on this, but we know you need, for example, huge amounts of money to get into it, for example. We know that there are very few women in the American Senate, for example, and so on. So it would seem to me, I would argue that if we had if that second part of this idea, equality between citizens in exercising control, if that were taken seriously, I think that might suggest quite a radical revision of the type of electorates we set up, the type of controls on spending, the type of... I am, as I get older and less patient about change, I'm getting more and more in favour of quotas. And that's anathema in the American political. It's just impossible to argue that. But it seems to me that unless we do something radical like that in the short term, I don't think we won't allow people to actually have equality between citizens in exercising control over collective decisions.
Hello. I want to ask, is there any signs of hope from the fact that it seems to me there's a huge rush of greater economic development among women, with banks, with small loans, with being given the role of being the economic drivers at a small level within a number of developing countries. Do you think that that will in any way impact little by little on one of those other measures of democracy that we might be talking about?
I think certainly they are very important. There is now, though, interestingly, Ellen, there are these interesting critiques of the Grameen Bank model, pointing out that they are not always so good for women. But I think you've certainly identified something that's absolutely critical, which is economic empowerment. And this, as quite a few of the interesting commentaries by feminists on the Egyptian revolution last year have pointed out, that for many, many years, women's groups in Egypt have been really focusing not so much on political representation, but on economic empowerment for women. And that's just an essential first base, I think, for all other sort of political capacity, if you like. And there is actually quite interesting developments in the context of Egypt, in the context of labour strikes that have been organised, which focus on economic empowerment. So I think perhaps that's where we should be focusing more and seeing democracy building. Often democracy building is connected with just getting a nice elite ruling your country who are very happy to be part of the global economic system, who will absorb Western capitalism, and that's a sign of them being good rulers. And I think that's another of the parts of the Western model that have to be seriously challenged.
Please join me in thanking Hilary Charlesworth.